Hello, everyone. My name is Claude Pirtle. I'm the CMIO at Walmart Health and Wellness and also an internist by background. I had the opportunity here to discuss a panel with our esteemed panelists here, Dan, also Mark. So today we're with Converge Accelerate session. This is going to be discussing explicitly exponential leaps in medicine with XR, extended reality technologies. In this session, we will discover how XR technologies are revolutionizing health from surgical simulation care, explore the regulatory challenges and clinical solutions associated with adopting XR in medicine, and finally look at what we can gain from these insights from their experiences and of XR care. So with us today, Mark Zhang, who's the Associate Medical Information Officer, Innovation and Medical Director of the Digital Innovation Hub at Women's. Also, Dan Scarf, whom is a CEO tech veteran and the CEO of X-Ray Glass. I don't know, Mark and Dan, say a little more yourselves. Mark, maybe first.
Sure. No, first, Claude, it's a pleasure and a privilege, as always, to be on any panel with you. So I'll just say that right off the top. But it's a real pleasure being here. I'm Mark Zhang. I'm the Associate Chief Medical Information Officer, focused on digital innovation at Brigham and Women's. And I have the pleasure of leading a group called the Digital Innovation Hub, which is really the center for innovation in digital health within our organization. We do kind of four big buckets of work, including product development, helping others make digital solutions, and then being a true hub for external companies and other groups kind of coming into Brigham and Women's and Mass General Brigham in the digital health space. And the reason why I'm here is because we also do emerging technologies work. And with that work, we've gotten very deep into extended reality over the last a little bit over 2 years now. It's been really exciting to get closer to this field.
Fantastic. Mark, and awesome background as usual, and always a pleasure. Dan?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Claude. And so I'm the imposter here today. So I'm not from a medical background. I spent 20 years in enterprise IT. So we had quite a few health customers. We moved systems to the cloud. So I spent 20 years doing that, sold that business. And for the last 18 months, I have been CEO of a startup called X-Ray Glass. So for those not good with their acronyms, XR is, of course, extended reality. In the right show, thank goodness. And AI is artificial intelligence. So we're all about fusing XR and AI together.
Thank you. And as we kind of alluded to in the beginning, I'm moderating the panel with Dan and just really discussing with them some of their experiences, some of the tech, seeing even the regulatory realm coming down the pipe over the next few years. Obviously, with the recent, ChatGPT and other technologies and AI over the past number of months, this has really blown up this field. Really can come to the front. I'll go ahead and kind of jump into some of the questions. We have a limited amount of time and a number of questions I'm sure people are very interested in. Just to kind of get things rolling in the right direction. I don't know, Dan or Mark, I don't know how you want to split it up. Maybe Dan, this one may be for you first. What are the most of medical XR technologies in the landscape? What are you seeing out there? Kind of, can you give us a trajectory or really how your company is deciding on or where it's been?
Absolutely, yeah. And before we kind of jump into the questions, it might be worth just spending a couple of minutes just unpicking, what do we mean by extended reality? Of course,
absolutely.
XR is this umbrella term which, refers to many, many different kinds of technologies. But actually, each are specific and each have their own specific use case. And, probably the two of the most interesting within that bucket are, of course, virtual reality and augmented reality. And for the audience who are not familiar with the difference between the two, obviously virtual reality is a completely digital experience, so where I'm stepping into a digital world, and that digital world can be whatever world I like it to be, or augmented reality where I'm still in the real world but I now have digital artifacts placed over the top. And actually, those two modalities are radically different in terms of, the scenarios that they support and some of the use cases within medical. virtual reality as a general concept, is fantastic for training scenarios. It's fantastic for, fully remote scenarios where I want to actually really step into the world or step into a completely different world. So, training is a fantastic use of that. Augmented reality actually potentially has far more uses, because then we can just be in our normal environment, but we're now starting to overlay digital assets over the top of that. Again, it might be training, but it might actually be remote guidance where the person that you're actually working with can see exactly what you're seeing and then can start to annotate over the top of it. So, I mean, there's just such incredible use cases for it. Mark.
Yeah, I think Dan is absolutely right. And I'm glad that he started with just base definitions, because it can be so confusing to think about this new field of technology and how it how it can be implemented in medicine. We started this effort about 2 years ago. So before 2 years, I would not say, I don't think I'm a true expert in extended reality even now. I've learned some things over the last 2 years, but I feel like I'm learning every day. And as we started looking into this field 2 years ago, the first thing we did was we learned the definitions. We looked at what was happening in the industry. And importantly, we started looking within our organization, National Brigham, to see what was actually happening now in the field of medical extended reality. And what I've seen has been incredible. It's still, I'm going to caveat this by saying it's still early days. I would say it's still early days for this industry, but oh my gosh, I think it's such a promising industry. The field of XR has been around since the 1960s, and the evidence base for medicine has been around since probably before the 80s, and it's just grown exponentially since then. When I think about like kind of the 4 buckets of use cases in medicine for XR, as Dan mentioned, I think the first most established bucket is really in this training simulation. A lot of companies, a lot of solutions. It's pretty mature. I mean, if you wanted to go out there and buy a solution, you could do that. You could do that right now. You'll have a couple of options, actually more than a couple of options. I think importantly, in medicine, what's really exciting about this field of XR is the second bucket, which are the clinical actual applications for XR. And those things can both be patient-facing, they can be clinician-facing, they can be diagnostic, they can be therapeutic. They're, at this point, typically point solutions. So solutions to specifically treat, lazy eye, or, over the last couple of months, there have actually been a couple of companies who have raised almost collectively $200 million doing this kind of what I call a Valhalla use case in XR, which is overlaying CT scans and MRIs onto the patient CT scans and MRIs onto the patient, and using a combination of markers and artificial intelligence to actually manipulate them in real time. Imagine being an interventionalist or a proceduralist, being able to have a one-to-one accurate representation of what's happening inside of your patient while you're doing a procedure without actually using any radiation or fluoroscopy. It's crazy. And that's kind of, we're at the cusp of this kind of new field, and XR is going to enable that. Just quickly, I think the third and fourth kind of major use cases for XR in medicine are kind of the non-obvious things that I think are going to have global major impacts over the next century. The first is, XR as a technology and as a field is growing both within medicine, but I think also just across kind of the general landscape of kind of users. And I think medicine is going to benefit from a lot of the administrative tasks that XR will enable. If you think about the field of kind of augmented reality, when you have kind of the ability to layer digital assets onto your real world, think about the administrative productivity kind of multipliers you get from that. The concept of having infinite screens in front of you. Whatever your workplace is, you can replicate wherever you are. That's the promise of what augmented reality is able to do. And I think medicine is going to benefit from that. Think about the concept of social VR, being able to have really meaningful conversations, really meaningful interactions inside of a virtual space when we can be on different continents, but it feels like you're in the same room. It's way better than a Zoom meeting. And I think healthcare is going to benefit from that. The fourth kind of bucket is what I think is kind of the furthest out there, but the most exciting. And that is what I kind of think of as like the etc. bucket. It's all those use cases that XR enables that are not kind of obvious, second order, third order kind of use cases where really it's almost dependent on the technology to enable these things. So, as we learn about the capabilities of layering digital technology into our real world, we're having these incredibly immersive kind of experiences. What does that enable that we just couldn't do without the technology? And we're starting to see some kind of burgeoning pockets of that etc. field that I think are just going to be incredible. And those are the things that we're going to kind of pull at that, frankly, I think is going to define the 21st century of medicine, but also the 21st century of humanity and our technology. So anyways, that's my.
No, those bucket. I love the bucket idea actually, and I mean those are fantastic. And I mean just looking back in our training, just trying to that AR having the for a thoracic surgeon or neurosurgeon, someone like that, to over that information on top of that a patient's body while trying to do a tumor resection, whatever it is, right? I mean that is absolutely game changer. But I think with the metaverse and these other, Apple, their tech and Meta and things like we continue to push those limits. Thank you both. Looking kind of next pieces of this is really challenges, right? What are you seeing that, I guess if you could really tier them, if you don't mind, like a tier 1, 3, what are some of the challenges that you're thinking that healthcare providers and organizations may face within some of that XR into their practices? Is it monetary? Is it training, or what are you seeing, Mark?
Yes, I think it's all of that. I think XR is an emerging technology, and as informaticists, and I would say we are all informaticists in this meeting, in this call. It's hard to even just get kind of bread and butter digital technologies kind of enabled, like just apps. That can be hard in itself. Now we layer a brand new kind of paradigm of compute that includes hardware, software, different heuristics of use. It's a big kind of challenge, and I think that even though it is a big challenge, it's the future, and we need to start working towards that. So to me, I think it's about layering the foundation, the right foundation to kind of make this happen in an appropriate, safe, and frankly, evidence-based way. Dan, I'd love to get your perspective on this, given that you're on the other end of this. You're actually delivering product. That's pretty exciting.
Yeah, and I think there are a number of challenges, and I think they are exacerbated in medicine, but general across the entire industry, to be honest. And chief amongst them is the hardware that's available right now. The devices are just still not quite ready yet. You look at, again, the two buckets, virtual reality, augmented reality. From a virtual reality standpoint, there's a few consumer devices out there. There's a couple of enterprise devices, perhaps, but, not a huge amount of choice. From an augmented reality standpoint, even fewer. You've got things like the Magic Leap. Again, you've got consumer devices out there, but there's no device you'd immediately point to and say, that's the killer device. It's the device we've all been waiting for. There's trade-offs with all of them, and also they all have their own separate ecosystems. Again, one of the big challenges right now, you're writing a piece of software, you write it for a device. So you then have to make sure that all of your customers have that same device as well, or you have to write a piece of software which works across multiple different pieces of hardware like we've had to do, which is an absolute nightmare. So the hardware, the software, and just the lack of software in general, along with having to write for the specific set of glasses, you have to write for spatial computing in general. You can't just take an existing app and just tweak it a little bit and all of a sudden it's magically a spatial application. We're going from a 2D world to a 3D world. And so that requires re-engineering of all the applications. Ironically, the most in-demand skill set right now in VR and AR are games developers, because actually you write augmented reality software using the same platforms as you write computer games for, because guess what, computer games are in 3D. So we're now having to find all these people that used to write computer games for a living and try and convince them to go write medical AR technology. And so, there's just a lag in general, and I think that will be, the biggest challenge, getting that software and hardware right.
Yeah, and I think you actually bring up a really interesting point. I love that you brought up the computer gaming, the gaming kind of angle to this, because in some ways, I'm a simple man, so I like to look at simple kind of trends. And if we look at kind of the evolution of gaming, I feel like that's kind of where we are in many ways with this technological jump. There was a point back in the, I'm probably going to date myself now, but between like the SNES and the PlayStation N64, when all of a sudden there was a jump from 2D to 3D, and it was a total change, a total revolution, a total shift in technology. And to me, that is where we are, is to your point, that's the change. When we talk about kind of the potential of XR, and say what you will about the term of spatial compute, but I think it's a very appropriate kind of definition for like what we are talking about. Now, how do you actually how do you create applications and software, whether it's in medicine or just other software, to engage in your spatial kind of surroundings, whether it's immersive or augmented? That's a really interesting, challenging, and I think, frankly, that's the next internet. When we think about kind of that jump, at some point we are going to transition from that 2D Super NES internet to this new spatial internet, which will be that jump. And once we do it, it's not that the 2D will go away. It's just that the 3D will just be the predominant way we work and engage, and that's exciting.
No, I love the akin to the 8-bit to 16-bit jump, and I think
16
also
to 32, Claude. Just
was
let's
going
just
to
be accurate.
going to SNES. I mean, the 64 was 32. It's hard to believe. You're right, though. I mean, I think you're bringing up, Dan, some of kind of writing from those multiple forms. If it's Sega Saturn, is just trying to get it right. I think that's a beautiful point. One thing too, just to bring up, is just the people process technology of this, right? So looking at, I mean, the tech is obviously a day in this, but also foundation, as you mentioned, Mark, just foundation rights. People are used to this technology. You implement this in medical education, right? So in medicine, whatever it is, and just kind of maybe segue into that is what role does it play in medical education and training, right? How do these technologies, or really how do you see technologies really push the next level with medical, specifically in medical school, right? I think I don't know, I'm sure you, Mark, learn on anatomy on cadaver labs, right? Like, what is it going to look like 10, 20 years down the line? I don't know, Dan, if you want to try, whichever.
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're the experts here, of course, in this side of it. But I mean, yeah, that's the beauty of augmented reality as a category, is this ability to be able to, overlay this digital content into the real world. And, training is just the most perfect example of that. Rather than having to physically cut into something, you can actually now start to explore that in 3D. We don't have to necessarily be all in the same place. You can now have this, remote learning in, let's say, virtual reality now, because that's probably going to be the best place for training like this. And we can all come together, the best experts in the world, guiding you wherever they are. You're all stood in the same virtual room together, all learning together. But that is really the power of this spatial and immersive internet, is all standing in the same virtual place, learning from the very best, in actual life, I guess. Mark,
Yeah, I think Dan's absolutely right. I mean, and just to kind of think about where we are, I would say that, as I mentioned earlier, training and simulation is one of the more established kind of use cases. I would say it would be in bucket one. Okay. And if we were to kind of go deeper into kind of examples, you have globally some pretty incredible kind of examples of how people are already using these technologies to enable specifically training in healthcare. So there are companies that are creating, full on learning management systems that enable 360 views of, different environments like the OR or a paramedic kind of truck for trainees to get acclimated to their spaces, or being in the room when a procedure is being done. And you can just kind of be that. I'm sure, Claude, you probably have maybe good, but definitely memories of being in an OR scrubbed up, watching from probably a corner while someone was doing, maybe an hour plus. Anyways, what if you did it in OR from the comfort of your home? Well, that's happening now. And then for more sophisticated use cases, surgical trainees are using these kind of tools to kind of do high quality, kind of high fidelity surgical kind of step-by-steps within VR kind of ecosystems, with or without haptics. So, not only can you kind of go through the steps of how to do a knee replacement, but what if you did it with a virtual bovie that you can feel, and as you kind of you can't smell it, but as you kind of go through and do the work, you can feel kind of the tension
Resistance and tension, sure.
Yeah, placing a trocar, right? Like I did a demo of a company who had a use case for training ophthalmologists in VR, using VR, using haptics. And I'm not an eye guy, but just the feeling of pushing kind of a trocar into the globe, and the like pop as it went through the membrane and you got into the aqueous vitreous or whatever it is, was like kind of astounding to feel. And then, those are kind of the high-end use cases. But I think what's also interesting, because as you mentioned earlier, Claude, the people and process is very important. And, a lot of, even if you look at like kind of the existing consumer grade technologies, the cheapest technologies are still hundreds of dollars per unit. So as you think about how we scale these things, we've been thinking internally at Brigham and Women's on how we can leverage tools and technologies like WebXR, where we can enable some AR use cases using kind of web-based technologies that people can invoke using their existing smartphones. And one of the tools we actually created is a digital twin. So this is actually, I don't know if you can see it, but this is a QR code that we built for the nursing education residency. So every 2 weeks, we have about anywhere from 50 to 100 nurses that are onboarded at Brigham and Women's, and they kind of have different levels of skill. Some of them are fresh out of school and
Sure.
may not have much clinical kind of experience, and others are, pretty seasoned. And they all go through essentially an intensive course to onboard them. So everyone at least has a base level of competency. One of the things that they do is they go through what is inside of a Brigham code cart. So Dan, and for those that may not know, a code cart is essentially our emergency kind of cart with all the different medicines and tools and equipment that you actually have to break. It's almost like you break the glass when a code happens or a real emergency happens. And you have to know what's inside of it, because as a nurse running a code, you're in charge of kind of providing those kind of tools and medicines in a rapid way. So, before we created this digital twin, what they would do is it was very much a didactic kind of experience. So there would be a lecturer inside of a conference room going over the contents of a code cart, and that would be it. And they got like a PDF or a pamphlet. What we've created with this is a very low cost ID that every nurse resident, when they finish, they get, and they can scan this with their phone. They don't have to download an app, and it invokes a web XR experience that's a one-to-one facsimile of our code card. And they can tap each of the drawers, it opens up, they can look inside, they can look with their colleagues, their peers, they can use it as a teaching tool, a just-in-time teaching tool. They can tap into each item inside of the code cart and then get more information about what it's there for, what it's used, and things like that. We think there's a lot of promise in these web XR technologies to enable just-in-time teaching like this. So, I'm also an internal medicine doc, palliative care doc. You can imagine, like, what if we did this with central lines and put a QR code right in the central line kit, and all of a sudden you can get this exploded view of the central line kit, and maybe even a step-by-step that just kind of layers in front of you. That's pretty incredible. So that's what
No, I love that. No, I think even using that just as a teaching tool, as you're pointing out, and maintenance of that, right? If things change, it's definitely a different feel and look whenever it's literally you can open the drawers and things like didactic session.
I think what's also really interesting as well, of course, is taking that same training and applying it to the patients.
Yeah.
So how can we start to brief and to start to explain to the patients what's about to happen to them? Now, we might not necessarily want to show them the full horror of what's about to happen to them, of course, but it still strikes me that some kind of extended reality experience to explain these things to people, and perhaps with exploded diagrams and actually showing them, rather than here's a PDF or here's a 20-page long PDF that explains what's going to happen to you. The chance of that person reading it is pretty close to zero, but if you sat them in an immersive experience for 10 minutes, I'd say there was a fairly high chance that they might stick to the end of it. So
I think you're totally right, Dan. And I think that's like a really interesting kind of, as we think about the education piece, as we kind of created this digital twin, one of the things we kind of, and you're, Dan, as a product guy, you're probably way more dialed into this, but there's what we found, and what we're still finding, is that there seems to be like a sweet spot of now that you have the power to do this, what actually is it good for versus what is it just like a cool thing to do? And I think there are going to be these kind of educational opportunities where what we found is things that require spatial understanding, or kind of that 3D visual kind of understanding to really cement either a concept or idea or a step-by-step kind of process. Those are the things that really work, as opposed to, one of our first ideas when we were building this was, what if we made medication labels that were just kind of AR pop-ups? Wouldn't that be cool? And the answer is yes, that's very cool. But, I think the question is, what do you get out of that over just a straight up PDF that gets evoked from a QR code? And that's where we kind of had the ... we don't know. So as we kind of started thinking about it, it's really those kind of opportunities where you can leverage that visual, that 3D space to enable or to really cement a concept that really works. So I think one of the things we were thinking about that potentially had legs was, well, how do you use a spacer for inhalers? That's something that might not be as obvious for folks, where having that kind of 3D spatial understanding would make sense. So things like that make sense, as opposed to kind of just this is what you do and da 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 da.
That's a very question in primary care, right? So spacer without having actually it's hard to do that, right? So I love these case scenarios, but I can, and Dan, you're spot on. Like, what is pneumonia? Literally having 3D, hey, left lower lobe, this is what it looks like, this is why we're treating, and you can use this in multiple cases with surgery and surgical intervention. So no, this is super exciting, and it's very exciting too, Mark, to hear that the limits and rethinking what that education looks like with a code card. How do you people on the same page?
Actually, I'll just say with Dan, like with your company, I know you're using some really cool hardware to enable kind of your captioning. And I know there are other companies in this space as well doing similar things. But I think as we just kind of pull on this thread, as we think about enabling kind of these these use cases, having that technology to not only, because right now we're talking about use cases using WebXR, where you ultimately have to have a phone or a tablet to enable. It's like you're having a little window into this kind of AR world. But eventually all roads lead to, well, eventually it leads to like a neural link. But before that, all roads lead
come
to
back a little bit.
yeah, like we a couple steps behind before the knife, some kind of probably some kind of heads-up display or glasses. And that's really exciting as well, especially for the patient. There you go. There you
Something
go.
a little bit like this, perhaps.
Yeah, just kind of like that. Yeah. Oh, and it's kind of, I know what's wild about this. So, that type of technology that Dan's wearing, doesn't have a power source, basically has, and there are a couple companies that do this, enables like a 65 inch screen at like, 10 feet, and is just connected to your device, whether it's your phone or your tablet or your computer, via just a USB-C connector, and it enables incredible fidelity. It's kind of incredible to see. I remember when I was like 8 years ago, I spent a considerable amount of money. I'm a big gadget nerd, so this is just what I like doing, on one of the original consumer grade head mounted displays. It was the Sony HMD. I think it was like the Z1. Anyways, it looked like this, it looked like a combination of like a toilet bowl and like it was like 2 pounds, big visor. Looked like I was going to shoot lasers from it, and it created a 720p theater-like experience. And you had this big breakout box that you plugged in stuff with an HDMI. I thought it was incredible. And now, not less than a decade from then, we have these sunglasses that have no breakout box, have no power source. You probably could shoot lasers from them, and also they're incredibly. They're not cheap, but they're far cheaper than what the HMDs were. And that's like, I would say that's kind of, in the current state, that's like a V1, V2 kind of product. So it's only going to get better, which is kind of incredible. And so, yeah, I think that
you're just spot on, Mark. Just in that technological leap, just thinking. I guess question, Dan, what is that V1? Like, where are you at that stage? Just curious.
So we don't make the glasses. So we work with a number of different manufacturers. So these particular ones here are the Rokid Max. There is another manufacturer called XR that we work with. There's another one called Ray Neo, but they're all based on this same concept that Mark described, where we're effectively taking advantage of the compute and battery in a secondary device. Now, we all dream, of course, of an all-in-one, all-day wearable set of glasses. That's where we're all headed towards. But we have two slight problems there, unfortunately: power and thermals. So, until there is a battery breakthrough, and until we can get these things not to run quite so hot, we are still 3 to 4 years away, I think, from that halo device, if you like, that's really going to drive mass adoption. But these are pretty good. And to set context, these are about $400. So, compared to a contemporary set of augmented reality glasses that would set you back $2,500, $3,000, perhaps, it's order of magnitude cheaper, and they just run off your phone. So, we use them for real-time subtitles, real-time translation, and access to a real-time assistant. Now, again, not strictly applicable just to health, but you start to think of some of the scenarios that might unlock. I'm trying to have a consultation with someone who doesn't speak the same language as me. Perhaps I'm trying to elicit some very, very important information from them, which is going to determine their care plan. And getting some words slightly wrong in the translation, could be a challenge. Perhaps I'm trying to speak to someone who's deaf and can't communicate back with me. Again, those folks unfortunately have been left behind. But with access to technology like this, we're just leveling the playing field for everyone, really.
I think this is like another Valhalla use case, right? Like, what's so fascinating and exciting about the field of XR and medical XR is that it kind of spans the gamut of like kind of the science of medicine kind of fields, like surgery and other procedural heavy fields, and then also the art and humanity of medicine, whether it's palliative care, I'm a palliative care doctor, or psychiatry, or even more broad, like breaking down kind of barriers of language. And to me, I think this, the ability to enable kind of understanding and connection with folks that may not speak your language, that's a pretty powerful thing that XR can enable, whether it's Dan's solution or others. That's kind of incredible. And I think that as we kind of move forward, particularly with just the leaps and bounds that both the XR technologies will gain, but also with AI, we are going to reach a point where language will no longer be a barrier for communication. It's not that big of a barrier anymore, but just the barriers for communication, particularly in healthcare, will just get less and less because these tools will enable. And those are kind of the sweet spot use cases that I think are practical sooner rather than later. As we continue to work towards building some of these critical foundational pieces like the evidence base, we need to continue to build the evidence base. We need to build the regulation. We need to build kind of the mass adoption. One of the clear things that Dan mentioned earlier, which I agree with, is, there isn't an incumbent platform to even build on, both for XR in general, but I would also say definitely not for healthcare. And you need those things. You need someone to kind of break those kind of barriers and start that work. Not saying that, some of the companies aren't doing that. We have some incredible kind of industry partners working in the healthcare space that truly are trying to move the needle. And I think timing wise, I hope that we'll get there in the next decade or so.
No, actually, that very, very, very spot on point. I mean, actually, kind of going to the next, really the headwind, going into, hey, low battery life, talking about the single platform source. Pieces are you hearing or feeling out there that are kind of, is it hindering it? Is it helping? What are you seeing in the field?
I mean, the form factor and the hardware is the single biggest, in my humble opinion, barrier to adoption right now. If there were devices out there that, didn't have wires trailing out of them and, you could wear for hours and hours on end, I think that would, of course, help adoption. Right now is a series of trade-offs, and it's, which is the least worst option right now, which is not, a great place to be. But, the hardware is getting better and better, and there's new glasses coming out, every 6 months. So we're just one teeny battery breakthrough away from, the promised land. But, there are some very, very clever people working on this right now. So, hopefully we will have a breakthrough soon.
I would agree with Dan. I mean, the other flavor I would say is, my sense is that new incumbents are coming in, and I'm really excited. I don't think Vision Pro, Apple's Vision Pro is going to, the first version, I don't think it's going to move the needle too much, but I do think that fundamentally it's a huge line, demarcation line, I think, for the field. And what I mean by that is everything before Vision Pro, at least on the consumer side, really had a VR, a virtual reality first approach. So immersion, the kind of the way you interacted was through discrete applications where once you got into the application, you were inside of that experience, and whatever kind of engagement heuristics were kind of defined by the application. Fundamentally, what Apple, I think, has done is reframed the whole technology. If you look at the actual Vision Pro, I mean, it's beautiful hardware, top of the line hardware, but in many ways, it's kind of just a VR headset with a very high-end VR headset. They've changed the platform and the approach from a VR first approach to an explicit AR first approach. And that, I think, is a huge, that's the thing that I think will, I hope is, one, I think it's the right direction, but two, I think that kind of change makes your interaction layer the default OS interaction layer. So the fact that you have kind of applications that live inside of your space as opposed to one application at each time. If we go back to kind of another analog, it's like the jump from Palm OS, if you remember Palm OS, to something like, iOS, or it's not perfect of an analogy, but it's that type of jump where all of a sudden now you're no longer thinking about the individual kind of program, versus kind of now you have this desktop framework and you can multitask and do many different things. Maybe the better analogy is Windows 3.1 to like a DOS to Windows. Actually, that's the guy.
Yeah, I
That's the
think
guy.
most people can resonate with that too.
Yeah. I think that's a major shift. And I also think that just this AR first kind of approach, one is the right one, and two is the pathway that I think we're going to get to productivity, especially for fields like medicine. I also think, just going back to kind of North Stars, my excitement for this field and my conviction that this is the field that will, one of the core technologies that will define the 21st century, is just the base truth that I think is inevitable, that we are going to move towards a world where 3D digital is going to be the next internet. Spatial digital kind of technology layered onto our real world in different layers will be the next internet. That is how we are all going to kind of interact, and it's just a matter of time. And if you think about it that way, it doesn't matter what the technology you use to engage with it is. It's really about creating those underlying foundations to kind of make this happen. So Vision Pro will eventually beget Vision Pro 2 and Vision Pro Lite and Vision Pro Ultra. And eventually Vision Pro is going to look like what Dan has. And then by then, I think that we will very much be ensconced in a world where the 3D internet is real. And when that happens, I think that's what's going to be the next metaverse and what's so exciting. Anyways.
No, this is great. And I agree with you. Well, I know we only have about a few minutes left, about 10 minutes left. I'll ask one or two more questions and then ask for some ending comments if you're okay. Just kind of going back to the patient, right? So everything lives around the patient. What are some of the dangers introducing technologies like this? Like what are we going to tell? I mean, it's great doing this in urban areas, but some of the more rural areas, like what are we going to tell people, that docs that aren't used to using this type of technology? How can we get them on board and show them the power, and also really prepare them for some of the
I think you've got the classic challenges that you have in the medical industry in general, in terms of regulation, security, privacy, PII data, all of the challenges that we grown to love or accept, are almost exacerbated in this new world. Because again, one of the big advantages that we were talking about earlier, certainly in terms of VR, is how do we bring people together from anywhere in the world? Well, the only way you can do that, of course, is if we're now starting to share data all over the world, which of course is big red flags particularly. So we've got to be, really careful about how we do that. As we talk about, self-guided learning for patients, any kind of self-guided anything is always quite dangerous, because of course you've got to make sure that you've given the right caveats and the right, explanation and positioning and so forth. That is one of the greatest advantages of, patient to doctor experience. As soon as you try and subcontract some of that out to VR experiences, then of course there's a danger there. As we talk about, how these things are technically going to run, I think there's going to be a bigger shift away from remote executed 3D experiences, because if you think about the power actually required to generate these 3D worlds and to place things into 3D worlds, I mean, that is a lot of math that you have to do. And, if you're trying to do that math on the device at the edge, then you need high-powered devices. And just as we've seen with computer games, they've all moved to Steam. And Steam is effectively remote hosted 3D engines where we're just streaming down the content to the console in that example. I think we'll see the same with XR. The most powerful use cases of it will require the most compute power. And unfortunately, that's probably going to be in the cloud. So I think there's some of the challenges, at least.
That's great. Anything to add, Mark? Or
no, I mean, I think there are a lot of challenges. And in fact, I'm not fully, one thing I didn't say is that, I am a little biased if you haven't gotten, in the last 2 years doing this work, I've become completely convinced that this is going to be a future technology, so much so that I think that it's going to be a new field of medicine. And to that end, I actually founded a a medical society. This goes back to the foundational kind of pieces that, need to exist for these things to kind of move forward. And one of the gaps, one of the blue sky areas that I thought is needed to kind of make this field grow appropriately is a nonprofit, interdisciplinary, interprofessional medical society dedicated to the field of medical extended reality. So I created the American Medical Extended Reality Association, or AMXRA, as that. And there are others, of course. So there are groups like in Korea, there's the Korean Medical Metaverse Society. There's International VR Healthcare Association and others. But really what we're trying to do with AMXRA is advance both the science and application of medical extended reality, but in a thoughtful and appropriate way. So some of the questions about adoption for patients, it's not clear. I think the jury's out, right? My sense is XR as a technology is still early and requires a strong scientific eye, along with an eye focused on public health, to make sure that the technology is used in an appropriate way. It might mean that for the next decade, the point solutions are really the things that kind of drive the industry, and that's okay, I think. Unless there is a breakthrough, and maybe there is, but there are a lot of questions that need to be answered about the, what's the most appropriate time to look at, particularly with our current technology for VR. You're fixing on one kind of one area for quite a long time. How long is appropriate, and at what age is appropriate to use these technologies? I think those are questions that are are worth asking. With all the good that this technology can bring, and there's incredible amounts of good, we also have to make sure that we don't not look at kind of the challenges and think thoughtfully about how we address them as kind of a society.
No, I think very, very, very valid points, and I agree completely. There's two other pieces, looking at the SDOH, determinants of health, the access, the equity, like how do we ensure that everyone has the same access to get the same great quality. Another piece too is looking at other technologies. So when you're talking about, Dan, we're going to need 5G. We're going to need all these other technologies to shoot it up to the cloud, do the processing and push it down. But I think, it goes hand in hand with a number of other technologies that are out there. So no, thank you. Great points. Global scape of things. We have just a few minutes left. Dan or Mark, do you have any comments, anything you'd like to add that we may have missed, or any other thoughts?
Well, I guess I urge everyone to be brave and to adopt this new technology. I can give you 99 reasons why you shouldn't use this, but I want you to remember the one why you should, which is, improving patient outcomes and improving patient experience. And I think it's all got to come back to that. And yes, there are challenges. Yes, there are roadblocks. Yes, there are things we need to think out and sort out, but let's not let them get in the way of improving the patient outcome. So be brave, embrace this new technology, and let's change the world.
Dr. Zhang?
I think being brave is incredibly important. And I think that I tell a lot of trainees who reach out to me, or I work with in a mentoring capacity, they may have some incredible ideas, and they ask me, what's the next step? And I always challenge them to just go and do it. And I usually, one of the things I always try and tell folks is, if not you, then who? And to me, I think these kind of technologies, it's great to be on these panels and talk about it, but at the end of the day, we need to do it. We need to actually move it forward. Talking can help a little, but if you really want to see this future, if not you, then who? And I would challenge everyone who's seeing this to think about, if you're interested in this field, to get involved, join AMXRA, reach out to Dan and other companies and see if these use cases and technologies might have a fit with the work that you're doing, or think about new use cases. It's blue skies, it's still early,
Sure.
We need all the help. This society, this organization, this technology needs people to power it. And we need a wide coalition of both technologists, physicians, researchers, and clinicians. So these are all things that I would say.
Brilliant. No, thank you guys. I really want to thank y'all for joining us. It's been a great panel, great discussion. Lots of questions. I do love the analogy there with the blue skies. I mean, we're very early on in this technology. I think there's a lot of different ways you can go, and also having anyone involved brave, right, to continue to push those limits. Well, thank you everyone again for joining us. I hope you have a great conference. I'm Dr. Claude Pirtle, and hope to see you again soon. So thank you everyone again.